welcome back to Jocz Productions. Today we're going to break down English colonial society, what was life like in the colonies, politics, religion, slavery, all that stuff we're going to cover in this video. Key point to keep in mind, regional differences existed between the British colonies. Remember, we have the New England region, the Middle Colonies, the Chesapeake, and the Lower South. And there were reasons for these differences. Who came to these colonies, why they came, and really important you understand the environmental and geographic variations of these different regions, such as climate, natural resources, and how this influenced their development. And as you can see on the map right there, some of the different variations between these regions. And real quick review, make sure you know the differences and similarities between the Chesapeake versus the New England colonies. They love asking about this topic. So quick review of the New England region. Remember, there were largely Puritan religious motives for colonization. And although these individuals, whether it be the Pilgrims or the Puritans, are coming over for religious motives, keep in mind they are not tolerant of other religions. They're going to develop a close-knit, homogeneous society. Settlements are settled around towns. The life expectancy is longer than the Chesapeake. It's also longer than what it was in England. It's a much more stable society compared to the Chesapeake region. There is going to be the importance of religion in the colonies. Obviously, family life is going to be key to the colonies, and education. In fact, they're going to require schools to be built. And as you can see on that town map, schools, churches, you got it all right there. Town hall meetings are going to be a unique characteristic of the New England society. All adult male church members could participate in this direct democracy. Large number of immigrants are going to come to the New England colonies, and they're also going to have a very high birth rate because you're going to have more of an equal distribution of men and women. There's not going to be big farming, no cash crops because of the long winters and short growing season. So this area is going to have a mixed economy. You're going to have some agriculture, trade, shipbuilding, and like I said, Boston's going to play a key role in the economic health of this region. Like we mentioned, make sure you can compare the New England colonies, especially to the Chesapeake, which is Virginia and Maryland, but the southern colonies shared some characteristics with one another. They are largely, especially in the beginning, a male-dominated society. Remember, the first people to come to Jamestown were men looking to get wealthy. This region has a much warmer climate, longer growing season. Life was harsh. You have all sorts of diseases like malaria, hot and humid, and you have a lower birth rate because there's less women in this region. Whereas the New England colonies are a tight-knit society, the southern colonies, the southern plantation colonies are going to have a defined hierarchy of wealth and status. You're going to get the rise of the southern gentry. So much wider gap between the wealthy and the poor in the Chesapeake and the southern colonies. In fact, a big reason for that is the rise of the cash crop plantation economies. You know, the southern planters are going to be the top dogs in the colony. They're going to dominate not only the economics but also the politics of the region. So in the Chesapeake you get the importance of tobacco. Remember, in South Carolina you get rice, and even down in the British West Indies you have sugar cane. There are fewer cities that develop in the South, obviously because of the agricultural nature of the economy. But it's important to keep in mind the labor system. Slavery existed everywhere in the 13 British colonies, but you're going to have this transition from indentured servants to slavery, especially after Bacon's Rebellion. And there's a lot of different reasons for this transition to slavery. Make sure you know them. 1, there's an abundance of land. 2, there's a shortage of indentured servants that are coming over to the New World. 3, there's no way to enslave the native population. They would just run away or attack or die of disease. And 4, there's European demand for colonial goods. So the transition gets made to African slavery. In fact, in South Carolina, the majority of the population is going to be made up of African slaves. And throughout the South, slavery is going to play a much larger role in the Southern economy. So a little bit more explanation about slavery in colonial America. 1 is the triangular trade route. This is a 3-part trade route forming a triangle. Slaves and goods are moving from Africa to the Caribbean and to the colonies. And you could see some of those goods that are brought between the regions. Also, very often goods would be going to Europe as well. Slaves brought over largely from West Africa are going to experience something horrendous, dehumanizing called the Middle Passage. You could see the conditions that these individuals were brought over in. It was all about maximizing profit and bringing large numbers of people to the New World. Keep in mind, slavery in North America was race-based. It was based upon ideas and perceptions of superiority, and slaves were considered property. Slave culture is going to develop as a blend of African and American traditions, blending these two kind of cultures together to create a truly unique African American culture. You'll see this in African American religion, song, and so on. It's important to note that there's a variety of tribes being brought over from different parts of Africa, and they're not just going to the 13 colonies. As you can see on this graphic right there, the vast majority of slaves are going to be going to the Caribbean islands and also to Brazil. But slavery in British North America, although much smaller, is going to play a huge role in colonial society. There are going to be some attempts at rebellion. The most famous and one of the few was the Stono Uprising in 1739, South Carolina. Slaves along the Stono River tried to get to Spanish Florida, where they were promised freedom, but unfortunately the rebellion was defeated, and it contributed to stricter laws, black codes, slave codes that regulated the movement and the freedoms of slaves in the colonies. In spite of the fact that there were few rebellions, it's important to note that there was different forms of resistance. Resistance to slavery was common, and it took the form of work slowdowns, running away, faking illness, and other things to kind of disrupt the slave system. Aside from the issue of slavery, religion created kind of problems in the colonies, and one of the big things was the religious passion was fading in the New England colonies. Fewer and fewer people were having a conversion. So less Puritans practicing means the colony is losing its original mission. To deal with this, the Halfway Covenant was passed in 1662 in the New England colonies, and it said individuals could become partial church members even if they did not have a conversion. And the idea behind this was to lessen the Puritan practices. They're going to be less strict in order to increase church membership, and it was successful at doing so. And as we talk about religion and this issue of religious practice, it's important to note that religious freedom, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, did not allow freedom of religion. But some religious toleration existed in a few British colonies. For example, you saw Pennsylvania with the Quakers, Rhode Island, separation of church and state with Roger Williams, and Maryland with its Catholic population extended religious toleration, but only to Christians. And religious freedom is going to be a key cornerstone of the new nation, so there are traditions established during the colonial period. A real wacky event happens in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. It's the Salem Witch Trials. During the trials, 19 people are hung, and one person was even pressed to death. That's a scene in one of the museums in Salem. Gruesome stuff. Most of the accused were from the money-making class, and the people who were accusing them were farmers. And really what you see in Salem is it reflects a growing tension over the changing nature of the colony from a religious kind of motives to a profit-driven commercialism. So you see the tension between the rich and the poor in colonial New England. Speaking of religion, a really important event that all colonies experienced was the Great Awakening. Many people were tired of the boring sermons that were traditionally practiced throughout the colonies, and the Great Awakening was a religious revival in the 1730s to 40s that spread throughout the colonies. This is the spread of religious feeling throughout the colonies. Many people converted to different religions, and some key figures you should know about. One, Jonathan Edwards. He sparks the Great Awakening with his sermons. He basically said God was angry at human sinfulness, and his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Some scary stuff. Another figure is George Whitefield. He introduced a new, energized style of evangelical preaching. George Whitefield led many revival meetings where sinners professed being saved and conversions took place out on the frontier. A key part of the Great Awakening was this idea that ordinary people with faith and belief in God could understand the Gospels without the church ministers telling them what to believe. This divided people. New lights were supporters of the Great Awakening, old lights were against this new style of preaching, and the impact of the Great Awakening was huge. You have new universities forming, such as Dartmouth, Princeton, Brown, some of the Ivy League universities today. They start off as religious-based institutions. This leads to greater religious independence and diversity. You have all sorts of new churches forming. You can see on the map the different colors with the different types of churches throughout the colonies. And as a result, this strengthened calls for separation of church and state. If you have lots of different religions, you can't have any one church supported by the state. And finally, this is the first mass movement shared amongst all of the colonists. This Great Awakening spread throughout the colonies. It did not matter your social status, your region, and it happened throughout. And so this was a shared experience. And key to this is people are changing the way they view authority. Common people are making their own decisions with regard to religion, and later on this resistance to established authority will be extended towards the British. So keep in mind all of the impacts of the Great Awakening. We've already mentioned the idea of mercantilism. Remember, there were various mercantile laws that were passed to regulate colonial trade and to benefit England. You have the Navigation Acts, the Molasses Act, and the basic principle behind mercantilism was that nations such as England should become self-sufficient and the colonies should enrich the mother country. However, the goals and interests of European leaders, for example in England, at times diverged from those of colonial citizens. In other words, many colonists did not like these laws, such as the Navigation Acts. Luckily, there was this period of salutary neglect throughout the early 17th century where the British had relative indifference to colonial governance. They kind of just let them do their thing. There were some things that made the colonists smile over the mercantile policies. For example, colonial shipbuilding developed, especially in the New England colonies, as a result of these requirements that goods must travel in either British or colonial ships. As a result of England being their mama, the colonists were provided protection of the British military, and mercantile policies provided Chesapeake tobacco farmers a monopoly in England. Remember, certain enumerated goods could only be sold to England. Tobacco was one of them. However, there were some reasons to be mad, some bad things about mercantilism. It restricted development of colonial manufacturing. They had to buy the goods from British manufacturing, so therefore the economy of the colonies did not diversify. Very often they had to buy higher priced manufactured goods from England, and farmers had to accept lower prices for their enumerated crops. So although they had a guaranteed market, they could not sell them to the highest buyer. And this was no bueno in the minds of many colonists. Resentment over laws imposed from a distant government in London did lead to times of resistance. Recall, England attempted to integrate the colonies into a coherent hierarchical imperial structure with the Dominion of New England. Sir Edmund Andros came over, started enforcing the Navigation Act, trying to bring more money over to London, and eventually that falls apart in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. Basically, under the Glorious Revolution, there is an overthrow of James II, and William and Mary take the throne. And this is important in the colonies for a couple of reasons. One, over in England, they put limits on the power of the monarchy, and the colonists, once the Glorious Revolution takes place, they rebel against the Dominion of New England. Colonists successfully resisted some English policies. However, it's important to note that the big turning point will happen in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War. Check out the next video. And finally, colonial politics. There was the gradual development of democratic institutions in the colonies and colonial experiences with self-government. And you're going to see this in various examples we covered in previous videos, such as the Mayflower Compact, the town hall meetings, the House of Burgesses, the elected representative assemblies in places like Pennsylvania. Keep in mind, many people were still excluded. For example, there were property requirements or religious qualifications, and England ultimately was still in charge. So in the colonies, there wasn't widespread democratization taking place. There was a ruling colonial elite that was usually made up of the wealthy or people in the powerful in the church, but the colonies are beginning to develop different political institutions. An example of colonial political life evolving during this time can be seen in the Zenger Case in 1733, which advanced the freedom of the press. And basically what happened, that newspaper that you see right there was printed by John Peter Zenger, and he printed a newspaper that was critical of the royal governor in New York, and that led some people to get that face you see right there. As a result of this newspaper, he is charged with libel, but the jury ruled that Zenger was not guilty. And what happens is, in the Zenger case, you see that the courts rule that you could be critical of elected officials if the statements were true. And although this case does not allow full freedom of the press, it does establish principles that allow people to be critical of those in power, something that's going to be very key to a healthy democracy. And the last thing to keep in mind is there was ethnic diversity of the colonies as well. Most of the people who came over were from England, but you get a growing group of people coming from other parts of the world. We've already mentioned the large African population in South Carolina, forcibly brought here because of slavery. We also have the huge amount of people from England, many of them Puritans up in this region, but you also get a growing Scots-Irish population in places like Pennsylvania. And as you can see on this map, the people that settled the 13 colonies came from all sorts of different ethnic groups. That's going to do it for this video. Thank you for watching. If the video helped you out, click like. If you have any questions or comments, post them below. And if you haven't already done so, tell all your friends about Jocz Productions and make sure you subscribe. Have a beautiful night. Peace.